Well, it's been some 40 years now that I've been publishing my evolving view of General Lee and the Battle of Antietam. Hello to you. I'm Joe Ryan, and this video, the last I will produce, is offered to those few of you who have enjoyed the class and who have absorbed the point of view I express in the series of videos identifying Lincoln's brigadier, the Illinois insurance salesman Julius White, as the officer responsible for the shameful surrender of Harper's Ferry, which gave General Lee, at the last second of time, the opportunity to bring on the battle he had lost Special Order 191 to make happen. Now, I see nothing left to do but offer an objective understanding of the probable workings of the mind of General Lee, which explains his motivation in bringing McClellan's army to the battle as he did. To do this, I encourage you thinking students to place yourself in the shoes of General Lee. That is, deciding what you would probably do as a reasonable person in the same circumstances in which Lee found himself at the end of August 1862. Given the objective circumstances, would you decide to go this way or that way? It is August 30, 1862, and we are standing on the Manassas Plain watching the disintegrating cores of Pope's army flooding westward toward Washington in the aftermath of their loss of the battle. What are we to do now? We know we cannot pursue the enemy up to the forts circling Washington. We have no means of sustaining ourselves at that place. Nor do we have the numbers required to penetrate its defenses. To sustain ourselves, we need to move tons of food and supplies on a daily basis, some 125 miles from Charlottesville on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad to Fairfax Courthouse. But the bridge across the Rappahannock was destroyed in the run-up to the Battle of Manassas, as well as the bridge over Broad Run and the one over Bull Run. Even if we might get the bridges rebuilt quickly, it is beyond the capacity of the Confederate government in Richmond to send up to us the tons of supplies we will need to maintain ourselves. Even if we fall back from Manassas and go behind the Rappahannock and wait on the defensive for the enemy to reorganize and march to confront us, we cannot count on the Confederate government at Richmond to find the means to sustain us there. Worse still is the possibility that the enemy may move its army by steamers to Aquina Creek, and repossess Fredericksburg, with the plan of moving again toward Richmond, and we will be forced to react to the threat by marching down the Rappahannock, crossing the Rapidan, and marching through the wilderness to confront them there. What is certain is that we know the enemy will be in our front again within a matter of a few weeks, say by the middle of September, either using the Orange and Alexandria Railroad or the Potomac steamboats to support themselves as they move to engage us in battle again. Can we sustain ourselves in either place through the fall and into December before winter brings us respite from active operations? One thing is sure: if we fall back, the enemy will have control of Northern Virginia again, and we will be hard-pressed not to find ourselves falling back upon Richmond before winter sets in, which means the enemy will open the spring with a campaign that threatens seriously to push us into the defenses. What alternative to falling back do we have? Is it possible, given our weakness in numbers and the exhausted state of our supplies, our famished animals, that we might hold a position close to the Potomac that the enemy must push us from before they can move deep into Virginia again? Here we go to the camp table and we examine our maps. Where might we position ourselves and be sustained by the countryside long enough to give the Confederate government time to reorganize a system of supply? The position close enough to Washington to freeze the enemy at the line of the Potomac. We see it immediately. Make our base at Winchester and draw our supplies from the rich West Virginia counties of Hampshire and Hardee and Pendleton, counties with farmland full of wheat and corn, pastures stocked with sheep and cattle. But if we march now from Manassas directly to the valley, the enemy will recognize the movement as our abandonment of the initiative, our acknowledgement that we have exhausted our ability to operate on the offensive. And won't this embolden them? Washington, now so full of new recruits, new regiments, and with stockpiles of supplies, under such circumstance, how long will it take before the enemy will be at the Blue Ridge Gaps, their long, fresh columns pouring into the valley to attack us? 2 weeks? A month? Now we begin to see the necessity. We cannot move to the valley directly. First, we must engage the enemy in a battle again, as intense as Manassas, that will severely damage its organization as Manassas has done. So much so that their losses in men and horses and artillery will induce their general not to pursue us, but stand instead on the defensive himself until his army's horses, men, and artillery are made full again by the government. Another consideration for us may be the question of image. How will it look to Britain, for example, if we fall back now behind the Rappahannock? What will Palmerston and Russell think? Right now, the Tories are debating the question in Parliament whether the Royal Navy should challenge Lincoln's blockade of our ports, to open them for the British merchant ships to bring us military supplies. Will their perception of our falling back be that we cannot win our independence by force of arms? And this will induce them to let Lincoln's blockade stand, dooming us to subjugation in the end. How will it look to the people of the adhering states? Will our falling back now give them confidence that they will beat us in the end? That all they have to do is keep the pressure upon us from the Mississippi to the coast, with no fear their daily lives will be disrupted by the war. No fear that their homes will be destroyed, their farms wasted, their crops and animals taken, giving them the will to accept the body bags, bringing home their sons for burial. But where to fight the battle? Let's shift our view now and put ourselves in McClellan's shoes. He arrives at Frederick and someone hands him General Lee's movement order. He reads it and turns to the map of Western Maryland. He has been to Harper's Ferry. He has seen the heights of Elk Ridge and Loudon, stood on the ridge of Bolivar, walked upon Camp Hill. He reads again the order, marking in his mind the fact that the Confederates occupying the mountain crests overlooking the ferry can throw shells down on it, but they can do nothing to actually overpower the 12,000 Union soldiers occupying the place. To accomplish this, the Confederates need an infantry force on the right bank of the Potomac in front of the place, twice as strong as the Union garrison, to storm the Union defenses and kill the enemy until the survivors throw down their rifles and surrender. But the only Confederate force that suits the bill is what Lee's order calls Jackson's command. And the order instructs that Jackson is to march via Sharpsburg or Williamsport, as he may choose, to Martinsburg and take possession of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad at that place. And then return to Maryland and join Longstreet's command at Boonesboro. We read the map in light of this, and we know if we are in McClellan's shoes, there's something fishy here, something askew. That without Jackson's force attacking the Union lines at the ferry from the right bank of the river, the Union garrison is secure. So Lee's dispersal of his army into pieces must be intended for a different purpose. To take advantage of our natural choice to move our army directly to the ferry. Now we look again at McClellan's map. We think about the fact the order puts Lee's main body at Boonesboro. And we see how easy it is for Jackson to recross the Potomac at Shepherdstown and march through Sharpsburg and Keedysville to cooperate with Longstreet in an attack against McClellan's columns crossing the Middleton Valley to reach the ferry. Whatever is happening here, we realize is not General Lee retreating, but maneuvering his army to offer us a battle. So what do we do? As long as the Union garrison at the ferry holds its ground, the Confederate force in Pleasant Valley is in a box canyon, with the only way out by moving on Rowersville. So we put Franklin's Corps, supported by Couch's division, at Rowersville to block the enemy in Pleasant Valley from escaping. Or, if the ferry for some reason falls, threatening our right column, which we will move on Lee's main body through Fox's and Turner's Gap. What happens next? Only the passage of time will show. How difficult it will be to gain possession of the crest of South Mountain, only time will tell. And once we have possession of it, who knows what happens next? Will Lee move his army then directly for the Potomac and cross back into Virginia? Or will he establish himself for battle somewhere between the mountain and the river? In the event, of course, we know what General Lee did. During the 5 days between his movement westward from Frederick and his letting go of the South Mountain crest, it would be foolish of us not to believe he examined the ground between the Potomac and Hagerstown, eastward to the mountain, and recognized the features that he could see and use, and recognized the features that he could use to the advantage of his weak force against the stronger McClellan wielded. Surely Lee recognized the tactical value of the line of Antietam Creek from its mouth at the Potomac northward toward Hagerstown, with its tributary Beaver Creek crossing the National Road between that place and Boonesboro, with only 3 narrow stone bridges available to McClellan to get his corps across it. Surely Lee saw the high bluffs that loomed along the stream's right bank, with the town of Sharpsburg planted on the high ground, the ground sloping down to the stream on the town's east and northeastern limits. It would be natural for McClellan, given the obstacle of the Antietam, to use the upper bridge in front of Keaneysville to get the bulk of his huge army across Hooker's Corps, Mansfield's, Sumner's, and eventually Franklin when he came up from Crampton's, and bring them across the open, undulating farm fields down in echelon on Sharpsburg, holding Porter's Corps as reserve on the east side of the Antietam in front of the Middle Bridge, and leaving Burnside's Corps for the coup de grace to cross the stream and attack when the day's fighting had forced Lee to strip the regiments defending his flank, sending them to the west side of the town to support the crumbling defenses on that side, caused by the hammer blows of Hooker, then Mansfield, then Sumner, and as Burnside's men crushed Lee's last reserve, on would come Franklin and Porter to join in the final effort of annihilation. In the event, we know how sharp was the razor's edge between Lee's army's annihilation and its survival. With thousands of dying soldiers withering like snakes in the ditches, moaning and crying for their mothers in the night. General Lee might have taken his army across the Potomac. Instead, he informed his incredulous generals that the army would hold its position and await the morning and the renewal of the enemy's attacks. When the sun rose over the South Mountain and the fog in the river valley melted away, and the enemy's attack did not come, then General Lee finally ordered his army's withdrawal across the river and into the Shenandoah Valley, where it rested in the pastures along the Opakin without molestation to the end of October. General Lee's camp was under the bowers on the Dandridge Farm near Bunker Hill. Of the three best-known British military theorists of the World War I era, Liddell Hart, Sir Frederick Maurice, and Colonel J.F.C. Fuller. Of these, the latter two officers expressed the opinion in their writings that it was foolish and reckless of Lee to bring his army to battle on the Antietam. Fuller considered Lee's decision to be based on nothing more than pride in his army and contempt for McClellan's. The battle, in Fuller's mind, was totally unnecessary. Maurice, agreeing with Fuller that the battle was unnecessary, tells us that Lee's decision to give the enemy battle at the Antietam was only justified if retreat was impossible without fighting. That, given the relative numbers of the contending armies, the best Lee could reasonably expect to accomplish by battle was to repulse the enemy's attack, with no chance of beating the enemy soundly. Lee fought the battle, Maurice says, to hold the moral ascendancy rather than lose it by showing the white feather of retreat. Here we must wonder what Maurice meant when he spoke of moral ascendancy in the context of General Lee's decision to engage the enemy in the battle at Antietam. Maurice must have meant the idea of moral domination, dominating the mind of your opponent by demonstrating that your willingness to accept the horrors of war, the death, the maiming, the destruction, is superior to his. That feeling this, he recoils from the experience, unwilling to absorb the cost of war you, by your will, impose upon him. It is an undisputable fact that after the great success of Lee's army at Manassas, Lee might simply have gone behind the Rappahannock, receiving his supplies by the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which was connected by tributary railroads to Wilmington, Charleston, and Atlanta. Assuming the Confederacy could deliver the tons of supplies his army required, the Confederate Army could simply wait for the enemy to march out again from Washington to renew their invasion of Virginia. It is for you, serious students, to search out the answer. Verify. What exactly was the capacity of the Confederate government at this time to sustain Lee's army behind the Rappahannock? Even so, General Lee's inaction would most certainly be viewed by the British government, which was then debating the question whether it should challenge the Lincoln government's blockade of southern ports as evidence that the Confederates could not lay siege to Washington as the Union Army had laid siege to Richmond. Evidence that the Confederate Army could not muster the military strength to secure Virginia's borders against Union invasion. At the outset of his movement into Maryland, General Lee had informed President Davis that though the Army was not properly equipped for the movement, lacking much of the material of war, being feeble in transportation, its animals very weak, and the men poorly provided with clothes, thousands of them without shoes, nonetheless, the movement was essential in order to maintain the initiative. And, as he put it, notwithstanding the great risk of disaster, quote, we must endeavor to harass if we cannot destroy the enemy, unquote. In the event, General Lee gained from the battle at the Antietam a credibility that his army was a bar of iron, that the Lincoln government could not break with an enormous sacrifice of human life and treasure, with no clear end to it in sight. The event certainly gives Lee pride of place among the generals of the war, but it also proves that the power of his army could not achieve more than stalemate. It could not achieve, by force of its arms, victory, independence for its people. The battle at the Antietam cowed McClellan into standing still for 6 weeks. Instead of hot-footing after the retreating Confederate Army, pursuing it so closely it had to keep moving deeper into the valley or stand and make a fight of it again. McClellan's paralysis allowed Lee to use Winchester as his base of supply, drawing his army's sustenance from the countryside, allowing the Confederate government to catch its breath, gain cooperation of the Gulf states in producing food and clothing for the soldiers, and replenish the army stock of animals, organize the railroads into a military transportation system capable of delivering these necessary supplies to the front, to recruit new regiments and flesh out the ranks of the old. Meanwhile, with Grant's operations in Mississippi and Louisiana, destroying the antebellum plantation economy, burning the farm buildings, killing the livestock as the army moved, the destruction leaving the bewildered Africans conjugating in masses behind the army as it marched. The Lincoln government, which in March 1861 had proposed amending the Constitution to make slavery perpetual in the Union, now proclaimed the Africans to be free and took up the task of supporting them, a task that has not ended to this day, enlisting the males into the ranks of the Union armies. And the War of Subjugation went on to its end.
More than 6,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were killed or mortally wounded here at Antietam, and 2,000 or 3,000 others were so badly wounded that they would never, they lost arms or legs. There were psychological casualties. It was an enormously costly battle for both Union and Confederate soldiers. The largest number of Americans killed on one day in all of American history. Was it worth it? That's really a question that's almost impossible to answer. If the result of the Battle of Antietam was, as I have argued, that the United States was preserved as one nation, indivisible, and now, as a consequence of Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, taking the first step toward making it a nation with liberty for all, then it may have been worth the cost in lives. But that's something I think that that every student of history has to decide for himself or herself. Is a political result, a military result, worth that cost in human lives? I personally think it was, but I can perfectly understand, recognize, appreciate those who might deny that it was worth that cost in lives.